Okay. Walter Hilliger is the president, editor, and the translator at Le Cercle Hilliger. He specializes in recovering the significant literary heritage of early modern Iberian Judaism from the post-expulsion era. His work focuses on major figures such as Isaac Orobio, David Nieto, Menashe ben Israel, and Moshe Rafael d'Aguilar. Mr. Hilliger oversees the entire process of textual revival from paleography, restoration, and digitation to transcription, annotation, and parallel multilingual translation for publication. And he will talk today about the beyond the difference, translating classical philosophical nuances. Please.
So, before we begin, I'd like to let you know that the full paper and the sources are available on our website at research.exegetes.org. I've shared the links in the chat, or you can go at the link at the bottom of a section of Certamen Philosophicum. There you will find also a translation. So I don't have a PowerPoint. But let me begin with a simple question. Have you ever used words like different, diverse, and distinct almost interchangeably? If so, well, it happens, and I've seen it more than a few times in everyday conversations, in books, and in modern translations. It feels like these terms and their notions have just flattened out into one general meaning. I can tell you that this isn't just some minor lexical problem, but actually a really profound shift. It is even a change in paradigm. The rupture between classical and modern ways of seeing the world. This happened way back 200 to 300 years ago. And the implications are huge because the blurring of these notions actually blocks our understanding of classical thought and of Jewish thought. The confusion of these terms makes some core ideas that shape millennia of philosophy harder to grasp, including how we perceive reality itself. So our purpose today is to cut through their confusion, and I hope that by the end of this 50-minute talk, you will be able to distinguish between these three notions: difference, diversity, and distinction. And possibly, you will also understand why keeping their individual meaning straight is important. When we talk about the classical period in Jewish philosophy, we are looking at the medieval era. In the words of the 19th century scholar David Kaufmann, who published in 1897 Die Geschichte der Attributenlehre in der jüdischen Religionsphilosophie des Mittelalters von Sadia bis Maimonides, Seite 25, or page 25. The Jewish classical period, according to him, stretches from the late 9th century right up to Maimonides in the 12th century. So that's a formative period, and we can go until the 17th century, up to Menashe ben Israel, Isaac Orobio, David Nieto, and other Sephardic Jews. Because the term classical in the 17th century literature refers not to the era itself being ancient, but to the conscious return to classical ideas. And here are three examples. First example for diversity, as illustrated by Ibn Tibon, who translated the Moreh of the Rambam in part 2, chapter 40, where he speaks of how humans are diverse compared to animals. He says, man is a political animal with much diversity, shonut rabba. Diverse elements can belong to the same higher category, but they do not share the same essence or purpose. Second example for difference, in the Moreh, part 2, chapter 36, also translated by Ibn Tibon, he illustrates this term in the translation using the terms Sahavdel ve'inechem, the difference between them, referring to the difference between a veridic dream, Halom Emet, and prophecy, Nevuach. Both share the power of imagination, the Koach HaMedameh, as an essential property, but they differ by the influx of intellect, Cercle. So that's different. The third example for distinct, again, Ibn Tibon's translation of the Moreh, part 2, chapter 6. Maimonides illustrates Aristotelian terminology for metaphysical beings using the term nivdalim, referring to immaterial distinct intellects. What the prophets call angels or malachim, and Aristotle calls sechalim nivdalim, distinct intellects. So to really grasp these notions and this paradigm shift, first we need to lay down some classical foundations. David Kaufmann wrote that the early classical period in Judaism is defined by the use of two central concepts. The first is substance, substantia in Latin, etsem in Hebrew, meaning bone, which is etymologically related to atzum, meaning mighty, immense, in the sense of potential or substantial, in an indeterminate way. In this context, substance should not be mistaken for modern material substance. In classical thought, it's not physical stuff. And the other classical concept used in classical period is essence, which is connected to the Hebrew mitzvot, which denotes bringing into being. Maimonides used it to refer to the first originator, or the first mover of Aristotle, Hamatzui Harishon, who brought creation into being. So to understand the meaning of difference, diverse and distinct, we'll focus on the second classical term, essence, which is key, and whose meaning shifted dramatically until it disappeared. How do we get back to its original understanding? Well, a big part of it is diving into Aristotle's causal reasoning, the four causes. Causal reasoning is implicit throughout the ancient texts like the Tanakh. It influenced the oldest Greek translation, the Septuagint, and thinkers like Philo, Judaeus, or Philo of Alexandria. In the first century, he used causal reasoning to understand God. Forward to the 12th century, Joseph ibn Tzaddik, who was Maimonides' rabbi, explicitly used causal reasoning based on Aristotle and other philosophers in his book Olam HaKatan, or Microcosmos. A few centuries later, in the 16th century, Ovadia Soforno pointed out counter-arguments of causal reasoning in the Tanakh itself. So this concept was deeply ingrained into Jewish thought across millennia, across languages, and across cultures. To understand the distinctions between difference, diversity, and distinction, we have to arrive at the notion of essence, and to grasp the notion of essence, we must turn to causal reasoning. Okay? So beforehand, if you don't know the four causes or causal reasoning, they provide a classical framework for explaining things and beings, and they are fundamental for defining essence in classical thought. A short recap. Let's use a proposition as in Ibn Tzaddik's example. The proposition is, as for adornment, the goldsmith's art shapes a gold ring. First, you have the final cause. This is the purpose, the why, the reason or the end towards which something acts. In the previous proposition, it is adornment. Second, the efficient cause. This is the agent, the thing that actually makes the object happen. It's the who or what directly brings about the effect. The Latin subjectus means something underlying. The efficient cause is generally identified with the subject in a proposition. In the example of the proposition, it's the goldsmith's art. Then the third cause is the formal cause. This is the form or the shape. This is really the only cause that's measurable or quantifiable. It is actual and not potential. The Latin informare means to give form to. It's about the structure or form that defines what something is. It's in a proposition, the formal cause is the ring, the ringness of the ring. And the third cause shapes form into the fourth cause, the material cause, which is non-material but potency. In a classical sense, in Latin, objectus, it's what's grown toward, from potential to actual, by the form. This is the object of the stuff something is made of. It's generally identified with the object. In the proposition, it's the gold of the ring. So in an active proposition, the purpose, the final cause, brings about the subject, the efficient cause, to initiate an action, the formal cause that shapes the object, the material cause. And Aristotle used this to define essence, but he distinguished two definitions of essence. For natural beings, Aristotle said that it's determined by the formal cause, the form as essence. This is so in things that happen by natural necessity. Think about an avocado tree. It makes avocados, or maybe it doesn't, but it does so purely by natural necessity. The tree doesn't sit there and choose its purpose. It's just an avocado tree. Its final cause, what it's ultimately for, is determined by its nature, by its form. So its form embodies its natural purpose, its essence, as in the proposition of the ring, the gold ring. But then, when we shift to the essence of human beings, the essence is determined primarily by the final cause, or purpose. So, in human beings, the purpose determines the essence, not the form. Because humans have an active soul, they possess deliberate choice, free will. Soforno calls this Tselem Elohim, the divine image. And in classical thought, this is associated with our intellect, the higher intellect. Because we choose with our intellect, the essence of humans is not determined by natural necessity, but by choice of free will. It's determined by moral necessity, the choice. The choice is about a purpose, not by natural necessity. That's a classical idea. So finally, we can connect what we have just learned with the notions of different, diverse, and distinct. Firstly, what's different can have an essential property in common, and this can be understood as a common purpose or a common essence. Secondly, what's diverse is separated essentially with different purposes or essence. And finally, what's distinct is totally separated. This brings us directly to Isaac Orobio de Castro. He was maybe the first to really denounce what he saw as the modern domestication and confusion of these terms. So even back in the 17th century, he saw this flattening happen. He highlighted the profound loss that occurs when these classical notions get confused. He wrote back in 1684 in his Certamen Philosophicum, "There is a shameful equivocation by foolishly confusing these notions of diversitas, difference, and distinction." And he meticulously reconstructed these classical notions. Divers, die Verschiedenheit, diversus or diversa in Hebrew shonut, what is mutually exclusive, diversa, does not concord or convene in any way and does not differ on one point or another. For example, the heart and the liver, they are diverse. They are both organs in the same body, same higher category, but in terms of purpose, essentially, the organs are diverse. Then we have difference, the Unterschied, differentia in Latin, or differences have the lim in Hebrew. Difference describes how one thing is not exactly the same as another, even if they belong to the same category or share the same essential property. Orobio puts it like this: other existences are differentiated by their accidental differences, like a tall man and a short man, a white man and a black man, but on an essential level, they share the essence of man. He also adds that man as an animal differs from beast by reason, which points to the shared essential property and accidental differences. So difference relates to attributes, whether accidental or specific, while an essential property is shared in their very essence. And finally, we have distinct. Die Geschiedenheit, or distinctio in Latin, in Nivdalut in Hebrew. For Orobio, this notion is maybe the most fundamental separation. Distinct things do not need any difference to be really distinct. This means their separation isn't based on comparing attributes with a shared category or essence. It's enough that one is not the other, and nothing of one is found in the other. Orobio's own example was Caesar is really distinct from Alexandria, from the lion, from the stone, and from the plant. Caesar is in a city or a lion or a stone. They are fundamentally separate things, totally separate categories of being. So in short, difference implies a confluence of purpose. Diverse implies a bifurcation of purpose, and distinct implies separation. So what does all of this mean for us today? Remember, the formal cause, what a thing is, and the final cause, what it's for, were deeply intertwined, especially in natures or natural being, like two sides of the same coin. But then came the scientific revolution and naturalism, which really is an ism. Galileo, Newton, Descartes, Hobbes, modern free thinkers started to reject final causes, especially when explaining the natural world, which is indeed governed by natural laws. But the focus shifted. They wanted explanations based purely on material causes, what things are made of, and efficient causes, what forces act on them, and they saw their essence only as formal causes, their formal structures or pattern. So the classical concept of essence, which was tied to form and purpose, was replaced by just the formal cause, without any inherent teleological aspect, without the built-in purpose that precedes them in time. Asking why a stone falls was replaced by how gravity makes it fall. The essence of water, which is to sustain life, was replaced by a chemical formula, H2O. Formal causes replaced final causes, attributing intentions or purposes to rocks or planets using metaphors, metonymies, synecdoches, and other rhetoric devices seemed anthropomorphic and primitive. This is what Spinoza called ignorance. And this philosophical current of modern naturalism was really pushed further by thinkers like Spinoza, who famously deprived beings of both teleology and the idea of inherent purpose and free will. But this is not new. It's a cyclical process, and it happened before, as illustrated by Maimonides, Gersonides, and non-Jewish thinkers such as Leibniz, who rejected the redefinition of essence as solely formal cause without a final purpose. As a final example, Soforno mentioned this in his Lumen Gentium, a new translation that we'll publish this year. He wrote, Al-Ghazali was mistaken in the sense he puts into the term property, appropriationis. For the meaning of appropriation is not similar among philosophers and among logicians. Logicians understand property as a distinction between similars or contraries, but philosophers, on the contrary, understand ontological property as what wisdom implies as a realization, that which is intrinsically in possession, that is the final cause. That's page 89 for King Henry II France edition of Lumen Gentium. So we have taken a journey through time, back when differentia, diversitas, and distinctio each had their own meaning, like today, when they are all reduced to the word different. And free thinkers stopped seeing essence as a finite cause and replaced it with the formal cause. I've tried to reconstruct this classical distinction that really did shape centuries of Jewish and classical thinking about reality, and bringing them back isn't just an academic exercise. The implications of restoring these nuances are endless, not only to understand things like divine attributes, the order of being itself, the logic of creation, but also to restore identities and answer questions that can only be answered in terms of purposes or goals. For example, the question, is Jacob different, diverse, or distinct from John or Ahmed? Is his soul different, diverse, or distinct? That question can only be answered in terms of essence, as their purpose in life. Another question, are Germany, France, and Israel different, diverse, or distinct from each other? One can only answer such questions using causal reasoning, by defining their essence, the purpose of their role in the world. So the invitation here is for you listening, whether you are a scholar or a translator dealing with text, or just someone curious about thinking more precisely and more deeply, try applying this tripartite framework. Challenge yourself every time you see or use the word different. Pause and ask, is this signifying a difference based on the confluence of shared essential properties? Or is it a diversity where things belong to the same root category? And they bifurcate based on their essence and purpose? Or is it a distinction where one thing doesn't have anything to do with the other? You can make that conscious choice by understanding the essence, the purpose, and you might start seeing nuances beyond difference. Thank you.
Thank you.